You're gonna get, I don't know how much taller.
We've already done it. Yeah.
Y'all gonna be tall girls or short girls?
You can go in there and get it if you want it.
When we gonna get you on a horse?
On this side.
I used to take horse lessons.
You did?
But one time, then I got afraid of a horse because he was too big. It was like high.
Yeah.
So I got scared then.
That's when you quit. I'm glad you're playing the piano. You're doing artwork?
Gracie does.
Oh, Gracie does. You
I just do piano and singing.
and sing. Okay, I love to hear you sing.
I can do this too. It's called a trill.
A trio. Okay, is that in your music? That's not it.
It's like the exercise before you sing.
Gotcha. Okay. Sometimes Johnny squeals in the car so high. I mean, he does it on purpose, and I can't hurt. My ears hurt. He can make a squeal. Yeah, I don't like it. Johnny, stop. Especially if I'm driving.
Oh, whoa, that's bad.
Yeah, that's bad. Now I am totally confused about their ages. So she's in the third.
I know Johnny's 6.
Let me see.
And I'm 6 too.
Are y'all? You're a little taller than Johnny.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
I think a smidge. I think you're a little taller than Johnny.
Okay.
I know.
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
You didn't
She
believe it?
said that I'm taller than Johnny.
I think you're a smidge taller.
I think Johnny's taller.
You think
Nobody's
John's
taller than Jesus.
Where'd that go from? That was God.
We're live, so I had to add a little something in there to the conversation. Well, we welcome everyone for being here tonight. We're going to start Daniel. We'll see how time goes. I'm going to try to move as best as I can. I would love to do 2 chapters tonight, because there's not a whole lot of interesting detail in chapter 1. Chapter 2 is where it gets juicy. And so we're going to see how we're allowed to do this. And to begin our lesson, I'm going to call on Pastor Kathleen if she'll say a prayer for us. You're right at the microphone at the camera, so.
Good. Father, we're here tonight to learn more about you again, Lord. And we just ask you to open these scriptures to us and let us see what it is that you really want us to know. We have many things we don't understand, and times are getting really strange. And we need your help, Lord, and we're just asking you to open the scriptures to us and show us what you have for us tonight. In Jesus' precious name, amen.
Amen. Now let's look at the first chapter of the book of Daniel, where Daniel and his 3 friends are being introduced here. We learn the 3 names of his friends and the fact that he is with them, but we really don't learn anything else about them after chapter 1, except in chapter 3, where they become the featured heroes of the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But we do learn in chapter 1 that these 4 men, together with others, were among the captives that Nebuchadnezzar took to Babylon to be specially trained and honored with rank as wise men and counselors of Babylon. We read this at the beginning. If someone would like to read verse 1. Daniel chapter 1, verse 1.
In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it.
Now, we don't read of this siege anywhere in the historical documents of the Scriptures. We read of other sieges, the one in 597 where Jehoiakim was taken captive, and then there was another siege in 586 where Jerusalem was destroyed. The historical books of the New Testament mention these 2, but not this one. Daniel mentions this one, but not the other 2. This is the only one, the only siege that took place, because there were 3 sieges that came upon Jerusalem during this time. this was the only siege that affected Daniel directly and personally, because this was the siege where he himself was taken captive in 605 BC, and it was the earliest siege. It was the first siege. Jehoiakim, who was the king of Judah, was apparently overwhelmed, but he was not overthrown by Nebuchadnezzar. Not yet. Nebuchadnezzar was able to have his way and come into Jerusalem. He was able to make the king a vassal and take what he wanted. Now notice what it says in verse number 2.
And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia, and put in the treasure house of his God.
Now, the things he takes become the things later that Belshazzar misuses and takes these articles that were taken from Jerusalem. Do you remember what Belshazzar did with them? He took the holy utensils of their temple and he used them to toast the gods of the heathens. And this is what Belshazzar was doing at the very moment when the handwriting on the wall appeared. You remember some of these stories now? They're kind of coming together. Within hours, this became the doom of Belshazzar's kingdom. Belshazzar died and his kingdom was overtaken by the Persians. Now, Nebuchadnezzar, when he took these utensils, he did not show the level of disrespect to them that Belshazzar did. He just takes them as a spoil. He takes them and he puts them into his storage in the house of his gods. Okay? It's the spoil he took. Someone read verses 3 and 4.
Then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge and quick to understand, who had ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans.
I love that name. Ashpenaz.
Ashpenaz.
It has such a ring to it. He is said here to be in charge of the eunuchs. Now, the word in the original language is said to be Rabsaris. Eunuch. The word eunuch. Rabsaris. Eunuchs were given responsibility under the king, and in order to keep them faithful to their task and to not be distracted. What would distract a man? A woman.
Why?
In order to keep them from being distracted, they were often castrated. And they were made into eunuchs. This was universally the case for the ones who were in charge of keeping the harem for the king. Right? The men who were taking care of the king's women had to be safe. But there were other offices, those of the court, that would require it too, so that the men would be focused on what they were assigned to do. The opposite sex can be a distraction when you're trying to focus on things. And this man was in charge of these eunuchs. It stands to reason then that Daniel, since he was chosen to this capacity, probably became a eunuch. It doesn't say that, but because of his position and where he was going, that's no doubt probably what happened to him. We never read anywhere that Daniel had a wife. We do read that Ezekiel, Isaiah, and Hosea all had wives. These were contemporaries that lived at the same time that Daniel did. But we do read specifically that Jeremiah did not have a wife. But this topic is not considered with Daniel. He doesn't say he did get married, nor does he say that he didn't. But the likelihood is that he didn't and that he was a eunuch. Ashpenaz was instructed by the kings to specifically find the qualified men that could be brought into the king's service. That's a very high position this man had. It required diligence on his part. If someone read verses 5 through 7. And the king appointed for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies and of the wine which he drank, 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of that time they might serve before the king. Now from among those of the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. These were their Hebrew names. I don't know why we as Christians can't remember the Hebrew names. But you say Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, boy, you know that name, right? It's easy. It rolls off your tongue. But their names were Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. It says, verse 7, to them the chief of the eunuchs gave names. He gave Daniel the name Belteshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azrael, Abednego. These names in Hebrew, I will say, the names that were given there, if you look at the name and you were to break it down, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, every one of those names in the original language incorporate the names El, as in Elohim, or Yahweh. So their names had the name of their God, our God, the God, incorporated in their names. The names that were given to them, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, take a wild guess. Who do you think their names were incorporated into? What other names? The names of what?
Of their gods.
Of Babylon's false gods. The name given to Daniel was Belteshazzar. That incorporates the name Baal, B-E-L. Baal was a Babylonian deity. The changing of the names was done to humiliate them, to bring them into submission. We don't read anywhere that these men were offended by this. Daniel was spoken of as Daniel after this. The other men were known by their Babylonian names after this. This was not a disloyalty on Daniel or the other three's part. It was not a disloyalty on their part to allow these names to be given to them. The giving of names over people is the main way you express your authority over them, and they had to accept that for 70 years they would be under that authority. Adam, remember, gave the names to the animals. That showed his authority or his dominion over the animals. God gave a new name to Abram, remember? Abraham. He also gave a new name to Jacob. What was Jacob's new name? Israel. And if you recall, even in the New Testament, Peter was not always Peter. Jesus gave Peter Peter's name. What was Peter's name before? Simon. And what about Saul? See, God gave him new names. It expressed his. They were coming under the authority of a new submission. Cowboy, you have a question?
Yeah, when the king gave Daniel a name, right, of another god, that
Right.
didn't offend Daniel?
Well, he had no choice. It doesn't say that he got so overly offended that it doesn't say he got offended. He may not have liked it,
Being of another
but
god.
now that you're going to be living here for the rest of your life, you might have to accept the fact that people are going to call you something else now,
Okay.
because that king did not want to utter anything that had El or Yahweh in it.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but that was
Right.
turning my head.
But what's the interesting part about this is, and I mentioned it just a moment ago, even after Daniel's name changed, the people still seem to refer to him as Daniel.
Okay.
Even the king, I believe, referred to him as Daniel. But the other three, they were known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But Daniel seemed to be able to keep his name for some reason. It just seems that way. They may have called him Belteshazzar. I'm sure there were times when they did, and there may even be times in the book of Daniel where they did.
Because he was a visionary and
But he did. He amongst his private associates, he kept his name, and they referred to him as Daniel. Daniel and these three men, we do know because of studying this book, were very uncompromising. They did not compromise God. Even to the expense of either the three of them being thrown into a fiery furnace or Daniel being thrown into the lion's den. They did not compromise. So we shouldn't consider that because they assumed these new names that they had compromised their faith in any way. Quite clearly, they didn't have a choice in the matter. Just like when we get put in isolation and solitary confinement, you can sit here and criticize, well, you must not be too much of a Christian because you're not preaching. Well, who are you preaching to? Who do you have to preach to?
No one.
You're not compromised. Your faith's not compromised, right? I'm just using that as an example. So I say these things because there are people in the church, scholars, critics, normally it's liberal scholars, who will use these little points to criticize the character that we're studying about. Now, they compromise their faith because they assume these names. Well, when you look at their whole life, they were uncompromised in their whole life, even to the point of being willing to die for their faith. Daniel is, as I said, referred to by the Babylonians and the Persians as Belteshazzar, but he didn't call himself that. The other men do use their new name, so apparently it was interchangeable. Let's look at verse number 8.
But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way.
Okay, it turns out that Daniel's resolve extended to his friends as well. Okay? It sounds like here that Daniel was the spiritual leader among them. It didn't say that these four resolved in their heart. What did it say? Daniel purposed in his heart, resolved in his heart. Different translations say different things. But it appears that Daniel here is taking the charge. In fact, these other three may not have initially resolved, but they followed his example. Daniel may have inspired them to do the same. Since it is mentioning all three of them, as I said, it didn't say that they resolved. It says he resolved. Daniel resolved. It seems, in my opinion, when you read this scripture, when you read this verse, that it was very deliberate to bring out that this was his resolve. So that kind of tells me, it's saying here, he kind of took the lead over them spiritually. He was like their spiritual advisor. He was the one who was the one they looked to for their spiritual support. As a young man, Daniel made a decision. And even though he was surrounded by paganism, and though he would be under pressure to conform, he drew a line that he refused the cross. That's what he did. That may be the reason he did not call himself Belteshazzar. He called himself Daniel. He had to allow the Persians and the Babylonians to be referred to that way, but when he introduced himself to someone new, he didn't say, hey, my name is Belteshazzar. My name is Daniel. In this case, you could say he would not cross the lines of defiling himself with certain foods. We're not told what defiled these foods. It may be these were meats that were sacrificed to idols. That's kind of an anachronistic, because this did become an issue for the Jews in later times. If you remember, it was the Jews' tradition not to eat meat sacrificed to idols, but it was not in the law. If an animal was sacrificed in the marketplace and its remnants were sold, it was not necessarily against the law for a Jew to buy it and to eat it. They weren't worshiping an idol by buying meat in the market and eating it. It may be that the meat that was offered was pork. Well, the Babylonians ate pork, but we know that the Jews did not. It has also been suggested that what Daniel was rejecting was the parts that were being sent to him from the king's table. if the king was trying to ooh Daniel with favor, it may be, if the king gave him favor, then what would Daniel be required to do as well? Return the favor. So anytime he felt like the king was saying, oh, that piece of meat came from the king's table, it was an honor to have such a gift and to eat it. But it may very well be that Daniel realized that with that, accepting that, it would come with a price. And so Daniel may have refused it for that reason. He didn't want to put himself into a compromising situation. The point is, Daniel viewed it as a compromise that he was not willing to make. Someone read verses 9 to 10.
Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would have my head because of you.
Okay, the chief was concerned that if Daniel ate, all he ate was vegetables, that he may not be as healthy. He might become more gaunt or lean. Well, that would not be a good sign of health and thriving. And if the king checked in on some of these men and saw that some of the men are not well fed, then the one in charge would lose his head. It wouldn't do much good for the one in charge to say, well, they requested this. King is going to say, who are you going to obey, them or me? Right? These were prisoners. So the man was in fear of his life if the king saw that they weren't thriving. Now let's go on to verses 11 through 13, please.
So Daniel said to the steward whom the chief of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days, and let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be examined before you, and the appearance of the young men who eat that portion of the king's delicacies. And as you see fit, so deal with your servants.
Now they were supposed to be in a 3-year training program, these Daniel and these 3 men, which means that the king would not receive them for the next 3 years. So a 10-day trial would not hurt anything. Let's give it a try. If in 10 days we don't look good, you can fatten us up after that. Well, the man was favorable to that. Verse 14 through 16, please.
So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At that time, at the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead.
Okay.
Yeah, I got something to add.
Go ahead.
So I've done it twice, and on day 10. And the first time I didn't know that day 10 was their day. And when I've done the Daniel diet, and I'm like, gosh, I feel good. And he can attest. I'm like, wow. And so I thought, let me read about this. And this was a couple of years ago. And I went, so day 10 is like, yes. You could tell a difference.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And this year too.
Mm-hmm. She might have just debunked what I'm getting ready to say.
Oh no.
It's okay. Clearly, eating fruits and vegetables and nuts is the way to go if you can do it.
I think it's the sugar. Maybe cutting out the sugar is what made
It's
it
probably what
a lot
it is.
better.
But there are a lot of people who are vegetarians who will bring up this story and say, see how healthier it is not to eat meat? They'll use this. After 10 days, they were healthier and robust. Well, that's proof that we shouldn't eat meat, is what they say. Well, that was not Daniel's conviction. That was not the reason why he did what he did, why he had this diet. Daniel was not a vegetarian. In fact, you really could not be a vegetarian if you were a Jew. You know why? What did you have to eat on Passover?
Lamb.
Okay? Jews were not vegetarian. They had to eat lamb on Passover. And there were other There were certain offerings they made to the priest that they shared with the priest. It was a communion offering. So Jews were not vegetarian. He just didn't want to defile himself with things that was defiling. And it could be that mostly the stuff that was coming from the king's table may have been defiling. Right? Whether it was sacrificed to idols, whether it was pork, whatever it was. And he said, you know what? I'm just gonna eat vegetables. I'm gonna keep it safe. I don't want to compromise in any way. As I said, the Jews couldn't eat meat. In fact, they had to at least once a year. There were clean and unclean animals. But Daniel would not be keeping the Passover in Babylon. While the Jews were in Babylon, there was no Passover. So he could make this diet and still not compromise anything with the pagans around him, and he couldn't compromise either with what was required of a Jew, because all of that stuff was suspended while they were captives in Babylon. So he just wanted to play it safe in all ways. There's no reason for him to keep the Passover, so therefore he didn't have to eat meat, and he chose not to. Now, this was the same conviction that some Christians had in Rome in the first century. Apparently, Jewish Christians in Romans chapter 14, it says, "For one believes he may eat all things, but he who is weak eats only vegetables." Now, that doesn't mean that these Christians were vegetarian. It meant that because they were in an environment that they were in, that they could not guarantee if the meat that they ate or that they bought at the market was kosher, if it was properly bled, if it had been sacrificed to idols. So since they couldn't verify where the meat was coming from, they just chose not to eat it. If the meat had been sacrificed to idols, if it had been properly bled or not, they didn't know, so they didn't care. They said, we just won't buy it. So to make sure, the Christians there in the first century, they avoided all meat. They were taking no chances of eating the wrong kind of meat, but that's in their favor. But what was against them was that these same Christians with this conscience was imposing that upon other Gentile believers and saying, how can you be of the Lord if you're eating meat? Well, see how they took one side of the coin looked good for them, and they had a good reason for their conviction. But then when they imposed it upon others whose consciences did not bother them regarding the meat, then now it became a problem in the church. Paul had to address that. He said, what may accuse some will excuse others. Romans 2:15. And as Christian believers, we may have a very strong conscience regarding certain things. If it's not biblically mandated against, we can't make a law on it and say you have to do this, you have to do that, you blah, blah, blah. We can't do that. We can't impose what's not biblical mandated on other believers. We live our life according to our conscience, and we don't push that on others. And we don't choose to judge others if they don't have the same view that we have. That's what Paul explained several times in his writings in the New Testament.
Well, didn't Peter have an issue with clean and unclean?
And he got corrected real quick when he saw that vision. Remember that? He saw all them unclean animals come up in a vision. And Peter had to correct himself. He got corrected. And he had to come back later, and Paul himself corrected Peter openly to his face in front of the whole church. And you know what's funny about that? Paul was at least 30 years younger than Peter. Paul was a persecutor of Christians who killed Christians. He's now an apostle. Here you got an apostle who was right there with Jesus almost from day one. And now Paul's having to correct him. How did Peter feel about that? Well, if you look at the epistles in Peter, I think it's the second epistle of Peter. Peter actually calls Paul our beloved brother. Peter humbled himself. He realized he was wrong, and he didn't think his position should have kept Peter from correcting him. When you're wrong, you're wrong. And if God can use a child to correct you. And when God does that, you better acknowledge that it's coming from God and humbly accept it, as Peter himself did. So, again, that's kind of a rabbit, one of those rabbit trails we go down sometimes. But I think really the reason why Daniel was robust and was so healthy, I'm not going to say that it wasn't the diet, because Donna confirmed that, and it's true, when I'm fasting and I'm eating healthier, yeah, you have more energy. There's no question on that. But I think in this particular case, because Daniel was trying to prove a point to the pagans, I think there was something supernatural in Daniel's health that was allowed to be seen by all that witnessed it. I think it was God putting good health on him more than usual. I really believe it. Just like Daniel, I don't think Samson was this big, buff man with muscles that were this big. Where did he get his strength from? He got his strength from God. He didn't get his strength from his muscles. Samson could have been a man with a build like mine. But he had a supernatural strength. And that's why people marveled at it. Because here you got a wimpy looking fella, and yet he can pick up 2,000 pounds. Wouldn't that be a supernatural thing to witness and to view? You know, I think this was the case here too with Daniel. His health was really supernatural.
Ain't no doubt in my mind, you know 100 times more than I do about this. I know one thing I know more about than you do. If I remember right, talking about the wine. The wine may have a lot to do with it. One was drinking wine and one that won't, or the way you look, the way you carry yourself. So as an ex-alcoholic, I was in bad shape a lot of times. I'm able to perform my job, just throwing that out there.
Yeah, it could be. It could be if they were drunk with it. But we do know that the Jews had to drink wine mixed with water because the water was not sanitary. So they had to have wine mixed in it. Alcohol killed the bacteria or whatever was bad in the water that made them to where it was safe for them to drink. So, but yeah, you're right. I'm sure if they were indulging themselves and getting drunk every night, that didn't help their health situation
Because
either.
too many, the barrel ain't enough.
That's right. Okay. There were many supernatural provisions in the book of Daniel. I think keeping 3 Hebrews alive in a fiery furnace was supernatural. Right? I think keeping Daniel alive in front of a whole bunch of hungry lions was supernatural. There could have been a miracle right here. Eating vegetables alone does not usually make a person fatter and fuller in flesh. But that seems to be what happened with Daniel. He looked healthy. He wasn't just skinny, and he looked fuller eating vegetables. I don't think that's natural. I think that was a supernatural thing. Normally we do these things to lose weight, not to gain weight. All right, someone read 17.
As for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams.
These 4 men were fast learners. They became fluent in the language and conversant in the Babylonian literature. But Daniel was the only one out of them 4 who had the ability to interpret dreams. That's a key thing to remember. Now, someone read verses 18 through 21.
At the end of the time
Chapter 1.
set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about the king questioned them. He found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus.
So at the end of the days, that's the 3 years of training. They brought him in to see the king. King interviewed him. And really, the king, according to this, was very impressed. Very impressed. They were better. They were probably more good looking. They had every quality that would make any king proud to have in his close proximity. And then it says here in verse 21, Daniel continued into the first year of King Cyrus. Now, that is from 602 BC, because remember, 605 is when Daniel went there. The years were going backwards. So Daniel got there in 605. He had 3 years of training. So what year would he have come before the king? 602. So from 602 all the way until 539, counting backwards, before Cyrus came. How many years is that? Almost 64 years. Daniel was there. Continued. It says until the first year of King Cyrus. That was 539 BC. 64 years. Wonder if Daniel was still good looking, fit, and robust. I don't know. Maybe. If he was, that certainly was supernatural. The main feature of chapter 1, as we just considered, is that Daniel and these men had a conscience that they would not violate. This becomes the issue in later times in other stories, especially in the fiery furnace and in the lion's den. They would face death rather than to compromise. They would remain pure. They would face death even in things that society would not think to be that big of a deal. These men were going to keep their distinctives. They were part of a Jewish counterculture in Babylon. And they were going to continue to bear witness in their lives to the distinction between the Jewish way and the pagan way. They were able to do this because of what it says in verse 8. Daniel purposed in his heart. This speaks of a determination, a purposing, that I think many of us Christians do not have.
Right.
I hate to say it, but I think there's so many of us who are not determined like Daniel was. I think most people don't have this. Having a purpose. I think most folks just float on. They go with the flow. If it's easy peasy, they're happy. If it's hard, they try, but they only do what everybody else is going to do. I don't think there are many people who start their day with the attitude, I have a purpose. I am determined. This is what I'm going to do, and this is what I'm going to do, even if it means I'm going to die today. I don't think too many start their day that way. Most of us have general values and ethics, and we occasionally have to face our ethics and be faithful to them, but other times not so much. A lot of people just play everything that we do by ear. Here's the difference. Daniel had a purpose. I'm going to live in Babylon, but I'm not going to be corrupted by it. I am going to maintain the same values, the same ethics, the same norms that I would do if I were home worshiping at the temple. I'm not going to allow my scenery or what's around me to change who I am. We sometimes fail to think that we can decide, we can determine, I'm going to avoid sin, I'm going to live right, I'm not going to be a bad example. It is foreign to many people's minds that they are in charge of such decisions. But we are. If you got the Spirit of Christ living in you, all things are what? You can avoid the temptation. You can avoid it.
Well, your mind is, your heart is also.
That's right. But it starts with starting your day with being determined. Today, I'm not going to say a bad word. Today, I'm not going to tell a story. I'm not going to lie. Today, I'm not going to pick up a beer. I'm not going to do that today. Now, I'm going to say the same thing tomorrow. But what did Jesus say? Don't worry about tomorrow. Worry about today. Every day has its own, right? So you get up each one of those days and you say, I am determined today I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to have bad thoughts. That's the type of attitude Daniel had. It was a daily thing. And that he was determined. He was resolved. You know what happens? People fail. We all fail. And when we do, we say, well, I'm not happy. What can I do? I'm under pressure. You know, I'm under pressure. I have to do it. I succumb because I'm under pressure. You know what? That's exactly what Aaron did. When they said, let's make a golden calf, Aaron caved in, and when Moses asked him, why did you do it? What did Aaron say? I was under pressure. I feared the people. While Moses was up there making the covenant, Aaron was down there making a calf. I was under pressure. You know what? That's what King Saul said when he did not obey Samuel. He did not kill all the Amalekites. When it was asked, why didn't you do it? It was the people. I was scared of the people. I could have done the right thing, but that's not what the people wanted. I was put under pressure. This seems to be the problem with religious people. Saul was a religious person. He was saving animals for a sacrifice. That seems religious, right? I was supposed to kill those animals that belonged to the Amalekites, but I saved them because I knew we need them for sacrifices. But that's not what he was told to do. Seems religious. What Aaron did was a religious thing, leading. He could sit here and make an excuse. I'm leading the people into worship to Yahweh using an image. This is supposed to help them reflect upon Yahweh. You see, religious people often conform to wrong behavior when under pressure. To them, being under pressure gives them the excuse. I couldn't help it. But let me tell you something. If you determine in your heart, resolve in your heart, I'm not going to compromise. I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to do that. If you make that resolve and determination in your heart, guess what? You have no excuse. And you won't allow an excuse to be there. We're told in the first chapter why it is that these four men, had an uncompromising attitude. We don't see any uncompromising situations in chapter 2. But we do see an example of Daniel's proficiency in interpreting dreams and visions. Chapter 2, look at verse number 1. In the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was so troubled that his sleep left him. Now, before the story is over, we'll see that Daniel is called in, not first, but last. While he is there, he leaves such an impression. He remains before Nebuchadnezzar. Yet in chapter 1, we read that they were brought in before the king after 3 years of training. But this is the second year of Nebuchadnezzar. How so? Do we have a historical discrepancy here? Chapter 1 indicates in the first year of Nebuchadnezzar, these men were set aside for a 3-year training program. The impression was that this was the first time that they had been brought in after their 3-year training. Well, the commentator Adam Clark suggested this, that in Nebuchadnezzar's first 2 years, he reigned while his father was still alive as a co-regent. The father's death was officially the beginning of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. And so this was the second year of that. If that is the case, this would be after the 3-year training and like the 2nd year after that. So this would be the 5th year after Daniel had been exiled into Babylon. So Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, and it woke him up. He was very troubled by it, even though he could not remember what the dream was, or he claimed he could not. Notice I said claimed. We're going to discuss this a little bit later. Perhaps he was testing them. Someone read verses 2 through 5.
Then the king gave the command to call the magicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans, to tell the king his dreams. So they came and stood before the king. And the king said to them, I have had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to know the dream. Then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will give the interpretation. And the king answered and said to the Chaldeans, My decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me and its interpretation, you shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made an ash heap.
Okay, now, this was not fully carried out. What we just read, my decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me and its interpretation, you should be cut in pieces. This is evidence that the king in Babylon could make a decree like that and then withdraw it. Now, the king of Persia did not have that provision. That is why Darius, remember Darius didn't want to throw Daniel into the lion's den, but he had to. Remember that?
Yeah.
King of Persia, once a decree was made, the king himself couldn't change it. But in Babylon, the king could withdraw any decree that was made. Verse 6, 6 through 9, please.
But if you tell me the dream and explain it, you will receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. So tell me the dream and interpret it for me. Once more they replied, Let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will interpret it. Then the king answered, I am certain that you are trying to gain time, because you realize that this is what I have firmly decided. If you do not tell me the dream, there is only one penalty for you. You have conspired to tell me misleading and wicked things, hoping the situation will change. So then tell me the dream, and I will know that you can interpret it for me.
Okay, this is a reasonable thing to ask. Nebuchadnezzar is awakened from a dream that he intuitively knows is important. He knows that. The meaning is important. He probably remembers it, but he's testing them to see if they know. That would be truly supernatural if they could, right? He wants an authoritative answer, not someone who's faking authority. Anyone can hear a dream and assign some kind of interpretation. If they are clever, they can sound profound, but how would you know that they were really getting it right? Right? In this case, the fact that they knew the dream would indicate they knew the interpretation. He could trust the interpretation if they had the knowledge to know the dream. When we speak of dreams, the Bible does say that dreams are a way that God reveals things to people. Joel chapter 2, Acts chapter 2, dreams and visions are part of God's way of revealing things in the Old and the New Testament. Peter and Paul had visions. Joseph and Daniel from the Old Testament had visions. Yet the Bible does not imply that every time you have a dream, it's God who is speaking. You ask, well, how do I know the difference? Some dreams are silly. Others seem profound. My view is that the majority of cases, most dreams are not related to a direct revelation from God. Most are not. Something you ate, thought about, worried about can create the content of your dream. There have been cases where the devil has tormented people in dreams. How do we know? Well, in the case of Pharaoh, they both sensed it when they woke up and the dream was of God. They both woke up with a sense. In my case, I've had dreams that I felt that were of God. I knew it when I woke up. I just knew that's what it was. Just like when you're awake and you feel God has spoken to your heart, do you question it? No. If you don't have a question about it, it's generally that is of God. Most of my dreams were regarding my ministry or what direction I should go or who I should associate with or who I should not. I've had dreams about people that were of a negative nature, and sure enough, it was proven later that those people had a negative disposition. Nebuchadnezzar knew there was something that was supernatural or distinct about this dream he had. He didn't want a charlatan telling him what they thought it meant. So he concluded that if a person had a supernatural ability to interpret it, then they would have a prophetic ability to know what it was without being told. See, you're throwing in gifts together here. If you've got that gift, that supernatural ability to interpret it, then you also should have a prophetic ability to know what it was before it's even said. So he presents this challenge. Now notice the response he gets from all these charlatan wise men in his court. Someone read verse 10.
The Chaldeans answered the king and said, "There is not a man on earth who can tell the king's matter. Therefore no king, lord, or ruler has ever asked such things of any magician, astrologer, or Chaldean." Now
that may be true, but Nebuchadnezzar was not the type of man to be rebuked by his servants. Okay? Someone read 11 and 12.
It is a difficult thing that the king requests, and there is no other who can tell it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh. For this reason the king was angry and very furious, and gave the command to destroy all the wise men of Babylon.
And verse 13.
So the decree went out, and they began killing the wise men, and they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them.
Now, it sounds like some of the wise men were killed before Daniel was made aware of his decree. Right?
Yeah.
That's what it sounds like. There were probably hundreds, maybe thousands of wise men. And he decided to get rid of them all because he was so disappointed and disillusioned with them that they had no knowledge of a matter that he knew was of importance. If it was that important, somebody ought to be able to tell me what this is. But of course, the messengers came to Daniel and his three friends to arrest and kill them. Let's see what happens. Verse 14 through 16.
When Arioch, the commander of the king's guard, had gone out to put to death the wise men of Babylon, Daniel spoke to him with wisdom and tact. He asked the king's officer, "Why did the king issue such a harsh decree?" Arioch then explained the matter to Daniel. At this, Daniel went in to the king and asked him for time so that he might interpret the dream for him.
Now, it seems that Daniel has some kind of station, some type of higher position. A man who must have had the king's ear. It seems so because he could talk the guy out of arresting and killing him. Did you notice this? To be able to negotiate with the arresting soldier, it meant that you had to have some kind of clout. The soldier knew the king would consider Daniel, right? Evidently, well, I think the king would want me to see what Daniel has to say. Daniel was a well-respected counselor. Again, showing he had some type of very high position here. Someone read verses 17 all the way to 23.
Then Daniel went to his house and made the decision known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah.
Can I interrupt real quick? This will be the last time in this book that you will see those three Hebrew names. From here on out, the only thing you're going to see is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Okay? Because they allowed people, they referred to themselves as such, because that was their name. But yet you never see really, maybe once or twice in reference to the kings, will you see Daniel referred to as Belteshazzar. Just a side point from what we talked about earlier. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah his companions, that they might seek mercies from the God of heaven concerning this secret, so that Daniel and his companions might not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Then the secret was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. So Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel answered and said, Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his. And he changes the times and the seasons, and he removes kings and raises up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and secret things. He knows what is in the darkness, and light dwells with him. I thank you and praise you, O God of my fathers. You have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we asked of you. For you have made known to us the king's demand.
So Daniel praises who?
God.
God's sovereignty. God gives wisdom. He raises up kings. Nebuchadnezzar or the wise men have nothing that God has not given to them. God has given the answer, and in this case to Daniel and his friends, that would save their life. Daniel was very pleased that God showed up. Okay? Someone read 24 and 25.
Therefore Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and said thus unto him, Do not destroy the wise men of Babylon, and bring me in before the king, and I will show the king interpretation. Then Arioch brought in Daniel before the king in haste, and said thus to him, I have found among the exiles from Judah a man who will make known to the king his interpretation.
Okay. Arioch had found you could say the goose that laid the golden eggs, he thought. Right? So it says here he went quickly. He was excited. Now a whole bunch of, maybe thousands of wise men were going to get their life saved now, right? And probably, Arioch probably thought that when I get there and I've brought the answer, what am I going to probably get? A reward. And it may be, I don't think the scripture says it happened, but it may be that he was rewarded. But he had found the goose that lays the golden eggs. So he quickly got there. Someone read 27 and 28.
Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, The secret which the king has demanded, the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, and the soothsayers cannot declare to the king. But there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Your dream and the visions of your head upon your bed were these. As for you, O king, thoughts came to your mind while on your bed about what would come to pass after this. And he who reveals secrets has made known to you what will be. But as for me, this secret has not been revealed to me, because I have more wisdom than anyone living. But for our sakes, who make known the interpretation to the king, and that you may know the thoughts of your heart. You, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose splendor was excellent.
Let's stop there.
Okay.
Let me say a few things before we get that far.
Okay.
It's interesting. Note here in the very beginning of this, it says, I think in verse 28, he said that these will be in the latter days. You see that?
Mm-hmm.
Some Bible readers think this is talking about end times of the world. They think that this dream is supposed to extend to the end of the world and tell us things about the end times. But latter times is just meant to be times later than the current situation. That expression is not really, when you study it, when you look at the Hebrew, it's not meaning something that would be universal. It'd be like saying, in a month or two, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. In a month or two. What does that mean? It's in the future, but it could be 60, 80, 90, 100, it might be 6 months from now. But doesn't mean that it's, okay, 2,000 years later.
It's later.
It's later than what it is now. That's what was implied with this word later. These things were supposed to happen in the future, not necessarily the end of the world future, but it could be the end of the future for Babylon, or the next one Persia, or the next one Greece. That may have very well was what was meant here.
Well, what determines when it could apply to end times?
Well, if as we get into the interpretation here that Daniel's given, and we study it and we look at history, we'll know whether or not it was if it's even determinable at all for end times. I'll go on and tell you in advance, the early church fathers and the reformers all the way up to the 16th century, they believed, and it is biblical, that everything Daniel prophesied was up to the first coming of Christ. That nothing that Daniel said had any reference to us at all. America was not in the picture. It ended with the Roman Empire brought in the Messiah. The Messiah came to the earth when the Roman Empire, he set up his kingdom, and now the kingdom is exercising itself through the church. And that stone is being grown and grown and grown into a mountain now, and the gospel has spread around the entire globe. That's what the early church fathers taught, according to Daniel's prophecies. It was about 150 years ago that evangelicals in America, starting primarily with John Nelson Darby, a lawyer in England, wrote a book about the dispensations. He was the first one to come up with that. Evangelicals grabbed hold of it, and it became the primary teaching of the church today. But fundamentally, going back to the history of the church, the first 1,800 years of the church's existence, they taught that Daniel was pinpointing to the first coming of Christ. So, and we're going to get into those specifics as we go on further. But that's just what the early church fathers taught. And it makes sense. What the early church fathers taught does line up biblically more with all the other prophecies in the scriptures. I'm not going to say that what's primarily being taught today is wrong. I'm not going to say that it's wrong. It could be right. But there's a whole lot more calculating you have to do to make it work. Whereas what the early church fathers taught was a whole lot more simple and easily understood. And it did make sense, because we do believe right now that Jesus is a king, right?
Yes.
Isn't he our king?
Yeah.
Well, a king has to have a what?
Kingdom.
A kingdom. Well, if he has a kingdom, how is that kingdom being manifested right now?
In the church.
In the church. We are the kingdom of God now. One day it's going to manifest itself globally when all world government is gone. But right now we are going into world government, and we are taking down, people who were loyal to their country is now being loyal to who? Christ. We're still citizens of those countries. We'll still, if we're called to fight for our country, we'll fight for our country. But our true loyalty goes to who? If God tells us, if the government tells us to do something that God said don't do, who do we listen to first?
Jesus.
So we're part of His kingdom, right? Our real loyalty is to our God. Cowboy?
I have a question and a statement like, when the chief guard come to get Daniel, there's a very good possibility in my mind, what looks like mine I got, that guard knew he could very well get killed by the king by not following orders and going back with them. So he must have really trusted Daniel.
Well, or Daniel had such a strong reputation that Daniel must have been very profound in what he did as a counselor and the way the people looked to him. For that guard to risk it and say, I'm going to go back and let you talk to the king yourself. For that guard to do that, that meant Daniel must have really been, high up there on the pole, to where the guard probably thought the king will probably, I can't take nobody else back and let him question the king. But if I take this man back, I know this man has the king's ear. There had to be some kind of confidence on that guard's part to know, hey, Daniel, and that means Daniel really had to have some high position, a very high position of authority.
I'm gonna be sure my mind is
Right.
And the question was, if you don't mind, I hate to interrupt,
Go
but
ahead.
yeah, but I'm curious.
You're the last one because we're out of time.
All right. There's two different kings. One could make an order and change it. No, we couldn't. Why is that so? I mean,
No, at the time that this was happening, there was only one king of Babylon, and that was Nebuchadnezzar.
right.
After Babylon fell, and the Medes and the Persians were now the ruling empire, Daniel, they took down Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar was dead. Daniel later became under the Persian Empire, under Cyrus. And Darius the Mede was the one in charge. Cyrus was out doing something else, and Darius was in charge. He was the king ruling over what used to be Babylon, and now it's the territory of the Medes and the Persians. The way that the Babylonian government's record, however they had their rules, if they had their legislature, whatever they had, it stated that the king, the emperor, could change a decree. But fast forward almost 70 years later, now Cyrus has come in. The Medes and the Persians have taken that area. All of Babylon's rules and laws and decrees have gone down the toilet.
So they wrote a new set of rules.
Well, no, they had the Medes and the Persians already had their set of rules before they came in and took Babylon, and their rules stated that once the king makes a decree, he can't change it.
That answers it. Thank you.
So that's why you have the change there. That's why in one case, the Nebuchadnezzar was willing to change his mind, and he did. After Daniel gave him the answer, he stopped all the killing of the wise men.
Right.
He changed it. But later, when Daniel gets, when they about the prayer and Daniel gets put in the lion's den, the king didn't want to put him in the lion's den because the king liked Daniel. But the king didn't have a choice. The law said the king, once he made a decree, he had to go by it. So he did it with hesitance and reluctancy, and it was early the next morning the king went out there to open the pit. I'm wondering if the king may have thought maybe Daniel's God will save him. And he may have anticipated that Daniel might be alive. I don't think he wanted to go out there and look at a gory situation, right? I wouldn't have wanted to open that thing up and see what was down there. But the next day, he went to see. And sure enough, Daniel popped up. And that was the best day he probably had in his life, that king. Because he did not want Daniel to die in the lion's den. So,
And maybe that was the one day Darius prayed to the God.
maybe.
He was up all night.
Yeah, and the Bible does say, that's right, Pyle reminded me, the Bible does say he stayed up all night. He couldn't sleep. And so he knew that Daniel was capable of bringing in miracles wherever he went. So maybe the miracle of the day was Daniel's life was spared. And sure enough, it was. So we're going to stop there because a lot of what I just gave as a foreview is going to be broken down more into detail in the rest of this chapter about the way that these words are to be understood. And we're going to stop there and we're going to finish, I think, where did we stop reading at?
31.
31? Okay, we might start back with 29 and then go down from there. And we'll finish chapter 2 next week. All right, well, that's all she wrote.
Thank you.
Well, I don't say she wrote, he wrote.
Yeah, right.
That's all he wrote. Okay?
He wrote.
All right. If there's no other questions, we will conclude with a word of prayer. Our great God in heaven, we thank you. We thank you for your word. It's truly alive, Father. Even though we're reading about things that happened almost 8,000 years ago, I'm sorry, these were things that happened almost 5,000 years ago. It amazes us, Father, of really what's going on in the life, what's going on, Father, in these stories. We're so appreciative, Father, for your word. We're so appreciative, Father, that you have given us insight into these matters. And we're able to understand it. We may not understand everything completely, but your Spirit has opened up our eyes to so much that we can comprehend it and we can put it together and fully understand that you are a God who is the same today as you were then. You still, Father, are setting us in the lion's den and in the fiery furnaces of this world. You're still, Father, showing up. You're still working in the hearts of political leaders. You're still working, Father, and moving, and you're giving us visions and understanding, and we're able to see things, Father, for our own personal lives that, of course, is in accordance to your will. All of these things are still happening, and we're very grateful, Father, that we're able to understand you more as we look into this information. You're a mighty God, you're a loving God, a wonderful God. Again, Father, I thank you. I pray your Spirit be upon every soul who listened in. I'm praying, Father, for direction in our lives. If there are applications that we have here, that we take it to heart and we move and act on it. We love you so much, and we thank you. In Jesus' name, amen. I'm going to correct myself. In my prayer, I said 5,000 years ago. It was 2,600 years ago.
I was going to correct you. I was calculating.
2,600 years ago, not 5,000. Okay.
That
At least I'm paying attention to what I'm saying, right?
We're going to have